Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the Interdependence Salon, the fourth session of this series brought to you by the Metabolic Studio. The Metabolic Studio explores self-sustaining and self-diversifying systems of exchange, feeding emergent properties that regenerate the life web. Today's salon will be with Margaret and Christine Wertheim, hosted by Doug Harvey. I'm Tristan Duke, and I will be your MC today. Just a quick note before we begin, we are going to be recording today's conversation for the Metabolic Studio's archive and YouTube. So if you don't want to be seen, please turn off your camera by pressing the stop video button in the bottom left corner of your Zoom screen. We're going to keep the audience on mute until question time. But also, if you have any questions during the conversation while it's happening, please write those questions in the chat, and we will call on you to ask your question during the Q&A. So we'll actually unmute you, and you can pose your question to the guests. Also, John Yee from the Metabolic Studio will be helping with tech today. So if you have any technical questions, you can message him directly in the chat. John, if you want to wave your hand so people see where you are. And also, before we get started, if you want to introduce yourself in the chat bar, just to familiarize yourself with that, you can say your name and where you're tuning in from in the chat screen. So our host today is Doug Harvey. He's an artist, writer, critic, independent curator, and experimental musician, as well as an educator who lives and works in Los Angeles. As a writer, he served as the lead critic for the LA Weekly for 13 years. And he has contributed essays to numerous museum and gallery catalogs. We have a sound issue. And our special guests today are Margaret and Christine Wertheim, founders of the Institute for Figuring, a Los Angeles-based practice devoted to the aesthetic dimensions of science and mathematics. As independent curators, the sisters have created exhibits for museums and galleries around the world. Their Crochet Coral Reef is a worldwide participatory project in which thousands of women have collectively crocheted coral reefs in response to climate change. That project has shown internationally, including recently at the 2019 Venice Biennale. Both sisters have authored and edited numerous books, articles, essays, and anthologies, far too many to list here. But now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Margaret and Christine Wertheim and our host, Doug Harvey.
Me talking about any of my impressions, we only have a limited amount of time, and it's such a dense and deep project that's developed so much over the past decade and a half that I think we should just dive right in. But before we talk about the coral reef itself, I think we should wind back and look at how you two came from being writers to participating in the Venice Biennale, presciently titled "May You Live in Interesting Times" last year. With what's basically a very kind of sensual, fiber-based installation art project. It's...
Oh, well, that's a nice question, Ducky. I'll answer it briefly, and then Chrissy can have a little go too. You know, when we started the Crochet Reef project 15 years ago, we began a project because we wanted to bring attention to climate change due to the fact that coral reefs, particularly the barrier reef, were being decimated by global warming, and scientists had only just begun to realize that. And so we thought we could do a community project and get other people basically to construct with us a crochet coral reef based on these mathematical formulas that can be crocheted to emulate the structures of living corals. And when we started the project, we didn't really imagine that it would take off as a worldwide movement, which it now has. And we certainly didn't imagine really that the art world would respond to it. We thought that because it was a project that was at the intersection of science and art, and it had all this mathematics and this climate change, that the science world would respond to it, and the art world perhaps would come much later. But the opposite happened. The art world responded almost immediately, and the science world being very slow to come to the project. So it's pretty astonishing to us that we've ended up in the Venice Biennale, and it's only now actually that people in the science world are really coming to the project.
And what about, you did some projects before the Coral Reef that were like the kindergarten project, and those were before the Coral Reef, weren't they? And
yes, so the Coral Reef project is the biggest project of the Institute for Figuring, but for some years before that, we had begun to do projects at the intersection of science and mathematics and art. Particularly what we're interested in doing, Chrissy and I both believe that ideas which are often presented in very abstract terms can be presented often through physically material play activities. So we've done projects, for instance, on mathematical paper folding, where we build giant models of fractals out of 50,000 business cards. We've done projects where we've curated exhibitions of people like Friedrich Froebel's work. He was the progenitor of kindergarten in the 19th century, and he also believed that children should be introduced to abstract, what we would think of now as highly mathematical ideas, through playing with material toys. So this is a theme that runs through our work, how ideas that are often presented in terms of physics, mathematics, equations and logic, how these can be turned into, as it were, activities that people can literally play with ideas. Chrissy sometimes refers to the IFF as a play tank as opposed to a think tank. So we think people should be able to play with ideas as well as come and just, as it were, symbolically engage with ideas.
Dougie, I wanted to say something in relation to your original question. How did we go from being writers to being artists in the Venice Biennale? I think that it's not so much from writers to artists, because I think in a way, well, I was an artist before I was a writer, not necessarily a great one, but I was an artist for like 15 years before I took up writing at all. But how did we come to this? I think there's actually a very simple answer. When we were in primary school in Brisbane in the late 60s, the kindergarten movement, which had in fact spread all over the world, still had vestiges of it in the maths department, in maths teaching in the state where we went to school. So we actually, everybody in Queensland at that time had these things called Cuisenaire rods, which are not actually one of Froebel's gifts, but they're related. They're made by somebody else, but they're on the same kind of principles. They're these coloured wooden toys that you can use to basically do arithmetic and very simple algebra. And we grew up with this final vestiges of kindergarten in our actual education, and I can't help but think it had a profound impact on us. We are products of kindergarten.
aren't we all? Yes.
Aren't we all? We are literally.
And aren't we all artists before we're anything else?
Well, on that note, Doug, one of the things that I think made Chrissy and I do the kind of work we do is that when we were children, our parents were, not particularly financially well off, and our mother insisted that we do things like draw our own birthday wrapping papers. So when we went to our friends' birthday parties, there was no shop bought wrapping paper. We'd be given butcher paper, big sheets of butcher paper, and crayons and glitter, and we'd be told to draw them. And we'd have to draw Christmas cards and birthday cards. And so our mum's idea was that everything like that we had to make and do for ourselves, which was part of a matter of economic necessity, but it was also because she had a philosophy of raising children, that it was important that we make and do. And Chrissy and I used to love doing this. Occasionally we'd be resentful, can't I just have the pink sparkly unicorn birthday paper like everybody else? But there was no question in our minds that it was a good thing to be doing and making for yourself. And I think the Reef comes out of that same impulse. You know, use the materials at hand. You don't need flashy, expensive anything. Do what you can at home domestically.
Did your mother crochet?
That was the one thing she didn't teach us. She taught us how to sew by hand and with a sewing machine. She taught us knitting and she taught us beading. And Margaret and none of the other kids took any of this up, only Margaret and I did. But from a certain age, I was making all of my clothes and a lot of clothes for Margaret. But crochet was the one thing that we just taught ourselves. I mean, if you can knit, you can crochet.
But the overall answer, Dougie, is that, you know, our mother taught us to sew and make all our own clothes when we were even beginning in primary school. And she had made all our clothes when we were children before that, and she'd learned that from her mother. So we came from a long line of women who just did all of this stuff, this feminine handicraft, as part of domestic necessity. Because, of course, you know, when we were growing up, to knit yourself a sweater was an immensely expensive endeavour.
No, it was the other way around.
Oh, sorry. To buy a sweater was expensive. To knit it was cheaper. Now the irony is that it's completely reversed. To knit yourself a sweater now costs, you know, hundreds of dollars. But we grew up doing all these feminine handicrafts as a matter of, you know, economic necessity, but also with a great deal of joy, because all of these activities are incredibly pleasurable.
Yeah, that's one thing I've repeatedly thought about the Crochet Coral Reef project, which is sort of a, you know, a kind of a sounding an alarm about the current global ecological crisis, is how joyful the actual, you know, artwork and the process is.
Dougie, sorry, Molly, can I answer this?
Yes, yeah, you go ahead with it.
You know very well that that's an absolute slander, that artwork is not meant to be about beauty and joy.
Well, darn, my credentials are going to be revoked. Can I take that back?
I mean, I think it comes from the fact that the people who make it, which includes us and thousands of other people, do genuinely enjoy the process. It's just an expression. It's an expression of the fact that when you're doing it, it can be, you know, it can be incredibly entertaining to yourself. Or at least I find it.
And a lot of feminists have written about the issue that making stuff in your hands is very, very, it's meditative and calmative, but it's also, you have this sense of achieving something. So, you know, you can be sitting there, you know, binge watching Xena Warrior Princess, as we were when we started, the night we started the project. But at the end of the night, you've got this beautiful thing that you made in your hands. So with very simple materials, very easily obtained, you can create something very beautiful. And what's wonderful is when we put all the reefs together and hundreds of people's work is put into one installation, you have the condensed, solidified work of hundreds of thousands of hours of labor that each person, you know, expresses themselves individually through their own piece. And it's amazing how, even though we're all essentially starting from the same formula, the same algorithm. People express it so wildly differently in the type of yarn they use, in the colors they choose. Do they use, fine embroidery thread? Do they use thick hand spun yarn? Do they use wire? What colors do they choose? And so you get this kind of sense of a living, growing ecology, which has come from the hands of each of the individual makers. So I think one of the joys of it is the sense that you're participating in a wider ecology in which everyone together is achieving something greater than any individual could do on themselves.
How much autonomy do the individual contributors have in terms of what they produce?
Molly, I'll answer that. The individual producers have absolute autonomy. We never give directions to anybody. In fact, I say never, but once or twice when people have produced, usually we find contributors because they participate in the satellite reefs, and then we really like their work, so we ask them if they want to contribute something to the reefs that the IFF makes, because there are essentially two types of reefs. There's the ones that we make, which is to say we curate, and there are the ones that people in a city or a town or a country, depending on the size, make for themselves that go with ours. But for the ones that we curate, we collect contributors. So we've got about 50 contributors from all over the world who participate in. These are the ones you're seeing here. Margaret will talk about the satellite reefs later. And what we have found is when we ask somebody, we say, oh, look, we really like that thing that you did in New York. Could you do another one for us in, say, yellow? It has never worked. Every time we've given instructions to somebody, what they have produced has been hideous. We don't want it. So the only way we can work with people is they make something and they either give it to us, or we say, well, you don't have to give us that one, but could you make something else? And then as long as they've got autonomy, it turns out beautiful. If we direct them and they try to do what they think we want, I can tell you it's never worked, ever. And we've even tried once. There are professional knitters and crocheters who like, there are people who do things like they crochet or they knit all the sweaters for the Cosby Show. And we tried one of these people once and we paid her. And when we gave her direction, what she did was horrible. It's amazing. So they have absolute autonomy. What then happens is then we have to select what we're going to use and we have to curate it together. So the curation of the reefs, at least our reefs, is a really major thing. But we don't have any criteria that we give to the actual makers. Oh, sorry, there's one criterion. Margaret has an absolute no squid and octopus policy.
Well, that's because a lot of people have wanted to go down the path of creating, realistic looking animals populating the reefs, starfish and octopuses and seahorses, etc. But the interesting thing is that it really interferes with the reading of the work as a work of art. So somehow that literalism, it just ends up Disneyfying. Whereas if you have the more abstract shapes that are hyperbolic shapes, which are actually emulations of what real reefs are doing, but you let it be as it were, an artistic representation of that rather than too literal, it reads as a reef, it reads as a reef as a sculptural installation. As soon as you put animals in it just sort of puts it into the realm of Disney.
Well, I think the reason for that is that when people are following the algorithm, they are simulating the genuine processes by which reefs are made by coral polyps. They're not representing something. They're not doing an image of something. It's more like it's process work. It's not like it's representational work. When people get representational, they just go to some default position. which actually isn't interesting. But when they're engaged in the process, they've got no default position. So the process of doing it becomes the thing in itself. And it's interesting that the reefs are not representational at all. If you look at pictures of real reefs, they look nothing like our reefs. The reason that they seem to be very similar is precisely what I said, because the processes of making them are very similar. It's not that they actually simulate the look of reefs, it's they simulate the process of how reefs are made. And as a simulation, they work very well, not as a representation.
And that comes back to the idea, Doug, that what we're trying to doing at the Institute for Figuring, and the Crochet Reef is a good example of, is that we're trying to introduce people to processes underlying mathematics and physics through giving people the opportunity to enact those processes for themselves. So rather than sitting there and telling people, well, this is the way living corals are formed, we give them that information, but then we say, look, you go and enact the processes through these crochet algorithms, and you, as it were, make a hyperbolic surface for yourself. And in the process of making that hyperbolic surface, you will learn a lot about how non-Euclidean geometry works. So our whole philosophy, and we feel we're very much inspired by Friedrich Froebel and the formal kindergarten philosophy, is introduce people to abstract ideas by giving them the opportunity to literally make those forms come alive in their own hands. So it's a form of, what's called in the humanities these days embodied pedagogy.
Is there a critical element to that?
Is there a what?
Is there a critical element to that?
Hopefully not.
But I think, it's an incredibly important, wonderful thing that one of the things that's interesting about the Reef project is that the fact that everybody who engages with the project is given an introduction to the crochet processes, which includes learning about how these processes are representations of non-Euclidean geometry, which the discovery of that in the early 19th century changed the course of mathematics. And this non-Euclidean geometry is the geometry that also ultimately underlies general relativity and thus the structure of the universe. And one of the things that we get told over and over again by the women who participate in our workshops is how empowering they feel that while they're doing a crochet that they associate with their mother or their grandmother, something that they perhaps always wanted to learn, that they're also being introduced to ideas that underlie mathematics and physics and even the cosmology of the universe, and how empowering it is to them to be taken seriously as minds capable of understanding physics and maths while they're doing a traditionally feminine handicraft. And it's very interesting that, with our project, 99.99% of the participants have been women, which actually wasn't what we expected. We always thought there'd be more women. We thought there'd be a significant number of men too, but it's been overwhelmingly women. But one of the things that attracts them to the project is the fact that within the course of doing it, they are going to be given access to this higher mathematics. And I think that's quite a rare thing, because very little science outreach, particularly not about the hardcore subjects like math and physics, is actually aimed at women.
Indeed. I'd like to come back to that, but what struck me about what you've been saying so far is how focused you are on the internal experiences of your collaborators as sort of being the goal of the project, and there's this whole other face to it, this outward facing presentation of the always evolving final product, And I was wondering if you have as clear a sort of an agenda about what you're trying to accomplish in that sort of domain.
I think one of the things about that, Dougie, is, anybody who's engaged in a process, especially if they do it for a long time, I suppose you'd only do it if you were interested in it. The process itself of making the things it's incredibly interesting to do it, and you can only experience it if you do it. So in a way, the reefs that come out of it are almost like a leftover of the process of making and doing and learning through making and doing. And the reefs that are exhibited are in some strange kind of way a byproduct. Now, that doesn't mean that they're not fantastic in their own right, but there is a sense in which the goal of the project is to enable people, and as Margaret said, they are mostly women, though that's not through any decision we made, but to enable people to engage with the higher mathematics and the higher scientific theory through something they can do in their hands. That is our goal, to enable people to learn knowledge that they might not otherwise have any access to through a simple form of playing which is not intimidating. So there is a sense in which the out-facing project is, as I said, a kind of byproduct. But having said that, do we have any aims for the out-facing project? Yes, because it brings attention to the whole issue of learning through embodied labour. I mean, for me, that has become the thing that I think is the most interesting side of the project, that in our society, since about the 18th century, as you know, labour that comes from the head has dominated over labour that comes from the heart or from, effective labour. The labour of caring for other people has dominated. Labour that comes from the head has dominated over that, and also dominated over manual labour. And any kind of labour that actually requires a body to do it. I mean, I would argue that mental labour requires a body because you can't have a mind without a body, but we won't go down that path. But labour that is innately coming from the body, using the body as one of its tools, is really downplayed in our society. And I think that's actually one of the really huge conceptual problems that we have. And I believe it's one of the big generators of why we've got so much excess stuff, because we don't value matter and the body, because we don't value the body. And so for me, the most important thing about the project is that it's bringing attention to, it's valorising and paying homage to embodied labour. And at the same time, it's paying homage to the embodied labour of the people that made the reefs, but it's also paying attention to the embodied labour of millions of polyps that make the reefs. So on one level, as we both said, the processes of making the individual corals, for want of a better word, the individual forms, simulates the individual process of individual polyps, but the process of collecting them all together over long periods of time and putting them together, curating them, if you like, also simulates the way nature works. And it enables people to see how much labour goes into a reef, a real reef, and it's the labour of polyps. But I don't know if I think polyps have rights, but they certainly work hard.
But picking up on that vis-a-vis the finished product, as Chrissy said, in very many ways, the art of the Reef project is the process of the individuals including making them. But then there's also the process of putting it together and creating from, these thousands of models that just sort of come in as Chrissy said, when you first get them all, it all looks a bit like an explosion in a woolly jumper store. But then, in a thrift store, but then you have the artistry of putting them together to create an amazing installation. And that's a very joyful process that's done by some small group of the people, often with consultation from us. But that process itself is an incredibly beautiful one, where the citizens get to, as it were, curate their installation. And one of the things, again, that we hear a lot of feedback from our contributors is how deeply meaningful it is to them that they've been given the opportunity to, as it were, collectively participate in generating an installation that is going to be in a prestigious institution. So, and we insist that in the context of all the exhibitions that all the contributors are named. And there's no question that it's very empowering to the people that their final work is being shown in prestigious institutions like, the Smithsonian, the Andy Warhol Museum, the Biennale. And in fact, one of the things that Chrissy and I have come to think of is probably the most subversive aspect of the project is that through this, we have got housewives into the Biennale and the Smithsonian. Our most beloved contributor, Evelyn Hardin, is a woman who left school. She grew up in Texas, left school at 16 because she got pregnant, never had the opportunity to have any higher education other than that. The most important job she's ever had was working as an assembler in a magnet factory. But Evelyn is an artistic genius who's created an incredible diversity of different reef models in so many different materials. And she's just got this wild, unbelievable creativity. And I feel so proud that we've got Evelyn, a person who would be widely regarded as nobody in normal art speak. But she's been exhibited in the Smithsonian and the Venice Biennale. And the insinuation of housewives into these elite forums, into these elite exhibiting forums, is something we actually feel very, very proud of.
Morley, perhaps you should show the reefs so people know.
Yeah, let's just see some pictures, John, of the reefs that the people do.
And describe what a satellite reef is, Morley.
Okay. So there, as Chrissy said earlier, there are two parts of the project. There's the set of reefs that we showed before, which are very highly curated, very, very finely done, that are crocheted and curated by Chrissy and me with contributions from a special, small, very skilled set of crocheters. Then there are what we call the satellite reefs, in which we work with communities around the world, and hundreds or even thousands of people participate in making a reef that is for their local community and is only shown in their local context. And this is what we're seeing now with some of the reefs. This one was done in Ireland, for instance. Do you want to move on, John?
Well, go back to and say, can you go back to the...
John, can you go back to the first one, the red one? Okay, so this is a reef this is the biggest one that's ever been made. It was done in a museum on the island of Fur off the coast of Germany, and about 900 people from across Germany and Denmark participated in this reef, and you see the vast scale of it. Can we move on, John? So this one, next please. This one is, this one was done in Ireland. Can you move on, John? This is a lovely photo of the people at the German reef collectively crocheting. Every week they had crochet sessions where ladies from all over the island, whether they were fishermen or, rich holiday visitors with holiday houses on this beautiful island, were shoulder to shoulder crocheting. And there was a lovely story came out of this, that on this island, there are two communities. There are basically the farming and fishing community who live there permanently and are generally quite poor. And then there's rich holiday people who have vacation homes. And there's a big tension between the two communities. But through the course of these crochet workshops, they all bonded together and became best friends, and it became this huge kind of sociological bonding across class and economic lines. So here's some of the women putting the reef together in this German one, and you see the incredible scale and size of what they achieved. John, can we go on? Oh, this was a little part of their reef that was shown in a big exhibition at the Deutsche Museum called Welcome to the Anthropocene, that was inspired by the work of Donna Haraway. This is an image, John, can you linger on this one for a little? This is an image that we love. These little children, this was taken in Melbourne, where there was a big reef done at a community centre, and the community.
You can see
you can see bits of the reef in the background, but this is a community centre where a big part of their population is serving women who, are escaping domestic violence. But in conjunction with this show, they decided to work with a local school, and the children put on a squid dance. So this is the children from the local primary school after the performance of their squid dance. And we have a couple of photos of the squid dance. Unfortunately, I haven't seen a video of it, but we just adore this photo. Can we go on, John? So this is a reef that was done in Asheville, North Carolina. But what you get a sense of here is just the wild creativity and, as it were, unrestrainedness of some of these community reefs. Chrissy and I think of them as being like female pieces of outsider art. John, can you go on? This is part of the same group of people. But, this one is the people of Abu Dhabi did this one, which had a very particular structure to it. But we've come to think of these as a bit like female versions of outsider art. And it happens to be the case that most outsider art that's been documented has been done by men, particularly large-scale environmental works like the Watts Towers. And Chrissy and I have always had an interest in outsider art and wondered, could there be outsider art work done by women? And we believe there probably is, but a lot of it's been handicrafted and therefore lost to time. So we see move on from this one, John, I won't explain that. We see these reefs as being like a new form of outsider art, except that they are being created for insider art institutions, but the people who are doing them, they're not trained at art schools, etc.
Can I say something here, Morley?
Yeah.
If you look at this photo, what I think is really interesting is the one in the back on the left-hand side is one of ours. I mean, it's the same scale, it's just the perspective. But when you see the what I call they're officially called the satellite reefs, but I like to call them the people's reefs. When you see ours next to the people's reefs, ours looks positively prissy and tame. The people's reefs have this voodoo feel. It's just unbelievable. You could never have produced that if you'd had professional artists making it.
Like this almost little unicorn horn off the top of it.
So how many people are involved in this globally?
Over time, there's been more than 10,000.
Yeah,
Wow.
we used to try to keep count because we'd ask everybody to give us a list of all the people. We know that some years ago it well exceeded 10,000, but it's hard to get people to keep giving you the lists of the names. But have
you had the experience of a whole kind of collective springing up without any knowledge of it? Just somebody contacts you and says, we've been making a crochet coral.
Oh yeah. There's been quite a lot of communities around the world who've, as it were, just seen our work and then been inspired and just gone running with it.
Wow.
Molly, can I say something?
Yeah.
In fact, if you go onto Pinterest and just type in crochet corals, it's gone completely viral. There are people all over the world as individuals or as collectives making their own crochet corals. You could do fill an entire huge art gallery with very, very different things that people have made basically on the theory that they're making crochet corals by this algorithm.
So
Wow.
in our formal crochet coral reef universe, Dougie, which means they've they've done it through a formal affiliation and alliance and collaboration with us. We've had, I think it's 42 reefs done now, and there's a couple in process now. But in addition to the ones that, as it were, have been formally affiliated with us, we know of dozens that have been done just as it were, as wild things. And we feel proud of that. And one of the things that we also know is that this methodology of working has specifically inspired a couple of other very large-scale community craft projects. And there was one in Australia specifically inspired by us, which took off hugely in Australia. And that was some people who'd been involved in the making of the Melbourne Reef decided that they wanted to do a commemoration for the ending of World War I and all the Australian soldiers who died in World War I. So they asked people to knit poppies. And in the end, they ended up having 200,000 people.
Wow.
Well, they ended up getting 200,000 poppies from something like 40 or 50,000 people all over the world. And they were installed for the 100th celebration of the end of World War I all around the War Memorial in Australia. It was really an incredible thing to see.
Oh, wow. I'm going to have to Google that.
It was beautiful. So we know that this methodology, and people have learned from us directly how to do this. And some people in London knitted a river, for instance, who'd been involved in the making of the UK Reef. And so we feel very proud of the fact that this, as it were, collaborative, almost wholly female craft-based, multi-authored work is in fact going on and has been given inspiration by our project.
Sorry, can I just say something in relation to that? It's almost, Dougie, as if we invented a medium. It's crochet, handicrafted seascapes or handicrafted landscapes. But I hesitate to say we invented it, because a few years after we started the project, we got an extremely angry letter from a woman from Australia saying, "You people think you've invented crocheted coral reefs, but my friend Helen, she was crocheting coral reefs in 1967, and the woman sent us a little pamphlet, a little small book of these women's crocheted coral reef installation from 1967, and it just blew our mind."
Oh, wow.
You could do a history of people who have quite independently invented the idea of doing crochet coral reefs. We're not the first.
But her one, actually, the 1960s one, it wasn't crochet, it was done with applique.
She did have some crochet.
It had some crochet, but it was primarily applique. But we do think it would be valuable for someone to do an archaeology of handicrafted coral reefs.
Be reinvented by different generations.
We should all these sort of amazing kind of grassroots political implications that the project has had are so rich, but one of the other aspects is the attention that the project has brought to the actual crisis with the both with the Great Barrier Reef and with the plastic, what's it called, the garbage,
Great Pacific Garbage Patch.
Yeah, I wonder if you could maybe talk about those two issues.
Yes, sorry, I've got to find my. Margaret told me I'm not to give a lecture, but you're going to get a small miniature lecture on garbage.
Little lecture.
So I'm going to share my screen with you. Are you getting my screen? Are people getting my screen?
Yeah.
Okay, so about a year after we started in 2005, and about a year later, we discovered, well, we didn't discover it, but we learned about the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. which is this, sorry about the terrible slide, which is this gyre in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, all because the Earth is a circle, is a sphere. The water flows in gyres. It's like hair on your head, and they have always been places where sailors avoid, because anything that falls into the sea automatically goes to, they're like vortexes. So, but traditionally what went into the sea would have been basically wood. It would have been bits of smashed up ship. Now what goes there is plastic. And this guy, Captain Charles Moore, discovered some time ago that this one here, which is north of Hawaii, north.
It's actually that one on the right-hand side.
Oh, it's this one?
Yeah.
But how come they're all over here, the sand beaches?
This is the one here. The one on the right-hand side is the Great Pacific Garbage Patch.
Right, okay, anyway. So all the plastic that falls into the sea basically collects around these giant whirls and whirls around and grinds itself up. So these are images from the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. It's just getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and I can't remember what the latest size. It's, 10 times the size of Texas and 30 meters deep, and it's just getting bigger and bigger. So we found out about this about a year after we started the project. So we simultaneously did two things. We decided that we needed to know how much plastic we were using, and we also started crocheting forms out of various kinds of discarded plastic, which I'll talk about in a minute. But so this is what we call the midden. And middens are just the piles of garbage that are left outside, accumulate around any human settlement all throughout time. So this is all of Margaret and my domestic plastic for 4 years. So we had, in order to keep it, we had to wash it. And my original plan was 5 years, but after 4 years of washing, because most of our stuff was food related and oil sticks to it, so it's really hard to wash. You have to do it about 3 times. And so we just got fed up. But so we sometimes show it as a thing in its own right. And it's interesting to see how much plastic we did generate in 4 years. And I can tell you now that if we did another 4 years now, it'd be at least 3 times that amount, because just the amount of packaging has grown so much over the last 10 years. But we also started making, there's a substance material called plan, which is you cut up plastic bags and turn them into yarn. So we started making forms out of plan. And eventually they grew into little installations, and then they grew into bigger installations, and then they grew into basically what we call the coral forest, which is a set of these large sculptural objects that are like, it's like a bit of metal dropped in the sea around which corals are accumulated, and half of them are made of yarn and half of them are made of plastic. This one in the front, this black one, it's all made of video. Video is an absolutely excellent source of recycled material. So, and
the white one's made from plastic shopping bags and saran wrap.
So the big forms is saran wrap, and the rest of it's plastic shopping bags cut up. And the reason it's got these speckled forms is because plastic shopping bags usually have writing on them. So when you cut it up, the writing makes this kind of, it's like variegated yarn. And you don't know what you learn after a while, but in the beginning you're really surprised by that. Beautiful. And this is what we call the toxic reef, which is made again of videotape, a secondhand designer sweater thing covered in plastic sequins, and then it's got down the bottom here, medical waste that someone gave us, the medical packaging waste, and other items that I won't go into. But I just want to, this is where the little lecture starts. I just want to say something. I've been teaching a class. This inspired me to teach a class in rubbish, because the more I started using discarded materials and rubbish, the more I started getting interested in the topic. And this little fact is going to blow your mind. Oh, sorry. Only 3% of what goes into landfills is from consumers. 97% of what goes into landfill is from the production of all things. So let's say you buy a pound of something, it doesn't matter whether it's carrots or a fridge or the Hubble Space Telescope. Say you use 1 pound, 97 pounds goes into, is wasted in the production of that thing, whatever it is. This is a generally known fact. And that only includes consumer goods. It doesn't include buildings, transport and infrastructure, which have their own. But again, it's the same thing. Production is where all the waste is produced. And it's because we have really inefficient production processes. So this is just some images of creatures around the gyre. What happens to them is they ingest the plastic because to them the plastic looks like other sea creatures. And they ingest the plastic and then they die because their stomachs are completely full and they can't digest actual food. But plastic has now become literally a natural substance. There are whole beaches in those islands around the gyre where, because the plastic's been ground up by the waves and wind action, it simulates pebbly sand. So there are whole beaches where the entire beach is covered in pebbly plastic. And these things are called plastiglomerates, which another person discovered a few years ago. And what they are is that when a piece of plastic melts on a beach and then sticks together, natural matter and plastic matter, and over time it's this geological process of melting and sticking and melting and sticking, and you get these things that are now called, they have an official name, it's called plastiglomerate, and it's now being sold in art galleries. This one woman has commandeered the market. It's quite a long way. There's one particular island that features them a lot. She goes to this island once a year and she sells them as her artwork, which I think is a bit rough. But plastiglomerate is a real, the point is plastic is now natural, and we now know that there are plastic microfibers in every body of water on Earth. That includes all of us bodies, as well as the seas and the rivers and the clouds.
Fossey, we should probably, I think they want to be opening up to questions in a bit.
Okay, that's my little lecture on plastic. So that's why.
Chrissy gives a whole course on rubbish, and this is a condensed version of her rubbish course.
It's a fantastic course on rubbish.
Yeah, rubbish is the new material of our time.
So, sorry, I have to take myself off share. Oh, there you go. Thank you.
Yeah, so maybe we will, on that note, transition here to some questions. I know there's been a bunch of questions in the chat bar here from the audience. So I'll turn it over to Bees from the Metabolic Studio. I'll unmute you and you can field some questions here.
Sure, thanks Tristan, and thanks Christine, thanks Margaret, thanks Doug, and thanks everyone for being here. The first question that I have on my list is from Maya, and Maya, I think you can unmute yourself to ask this question.
Hi there. My question was about materials and asking how material plays a part in the process that y'all work on. But you kind of really delved into that just towards the end there. So kind of generally speaking, when you're engaging with makers, how do you work with material? How do you start the conversation around material? And do you have any restrictions?
Well, this is a good question, Maya, because it comes up a lot. We encourage people actively to be as diverse in their thinking about materials as they possibly can be. So obviously the first thing is, if you're going to work with yarn, there are many, many different kinds of yarn. There's, very fine woolen yarn, there's flax, soy, hand spun, homespun, hand dyed. So we encourage people to think creatively about what kind of yarn they like to work with. And some people have a particular kind of yarn that they have some relationship with that they love to use. But we also try to encourage people to think about new things that they might not have thought about crocheting in. So we've had quite a lot of people a lot of people have done things in plastic, although plastic is hard to work with, so some people don't want to work with it. We've had numbers of people who've done things in different kinds of wire. Say you could get very fine, beautiful wires that are now used for jewelry making. There's very fine wires that are used for connecting circuits to microchips to circuit boards. And we've had people do that, crochet in that. So we want to be surprised. We want people to use whatever kind of thread that they can use, and think about it in the wildest possible ways and surprise us. You asked, are there any limitations? We do have some limitations, but it's really more the process rather than the material. So we've had a number of people approach us and say, I make ceramics. I'd love to make a hyperbolic ceramic thing for you. And we say, well, that doesn't really belong in this project. So as a kind of guiding rule, our rule is it should ideally be crochet. It should ideally be in some thread. But we have had things that are knitted wire sea creatures, for instance. And so we have some limitations, but we try to be as open as possible within the concept that the overall thing is a crochet coral reef. But material diversity is a big one.
Great. Our next question comes from Kim Williams. Kim, I'm going to unmute you and please ask your question.
Hello. I'm in Australia. I'm an Australian artist. I'm still sitting in bed at 6 a.m. or just after 6 a.m. here. Hi. Thanks. This is a really interesting discussion. I've been looking at your work for a while because I've sort of incorporated a discussion into it in my PhD. My art practice is about environmental matters, and in fact I've been collaborating with another artist, Lucas Eileen, for 4 years on a sort of fairly major project called Sugar versus the Reef, where we've been collaborating with farmers in Mackay and Queensland, sugarcane farmers, who are practicing regenerative agriculture, and which is a way of mitigating the impacts of agriculture, of terrestrial practices on the Great Barrier Reef. And so I'm kind of really interested in how you've been talking about the materiality of crochet coral reef, and that's really important to what we do too as kind of practitioners working within communities. But I'm also interested in the kind of the initial premise of your work, which was about your concern for the Great Barrier Reef and how you think those practices of crocheting and bringing communities together and bringing knowledge forward by doing these material practices. Do you think that creates a kind of ultimately a difference in environmental outcomes and in environmental practices and environmental policies that will actually help things like the Great Barrier Reef or the Great Pacific Garbage Patch?
Ozzy, do you want to answer that?
Yes. But this is another question that we get asked a very great deal, and we've had to think about it a great deal over time. And my personal answer to it, or at least my current answer to it, is I don't necessarily believe that art can be direct, or that art has to be directly political. There is definitely art that is directly political. I think our art is not directly political in that sense of affecting directly environmental policy or any other policy for that matter. What I do think is to reiterate what I said before, is I think the huge environmental disaster of overproduction comes from the fact that we as in Occidental society, through capitalism, have come to valorize certain kinds of work above others and certain kinds of activities above others, and we simply don't care about those other activities, that is to say, manual labour and the making of things.
Yes.
And it's that huge, massive mind shift which took place in the late 18th century in Western culture, which has to change back again in some way. And it's a tiny, tiny contribution towards that, but any contribution is something. I don't believe environmental issues are going to be solved myself directly by government legislation. I believe they're going to be solved by a massive conceptual mind shift. I think that's what it's going to take. And I don't really know what's going to compel that massive conceptual mind shift, but this project is about that. It's not about influencing government policy.
There is another aspect of the project that I believe is political in a less direct sense than you're talking about. Again, this isn't about addressing policy, but the aspect of the project that I see as politically important is the fact that the work of the community reefs is multi-authored by hundreds, sometimes thousands of so-called ordinary people.
Yeah.
And I think that one of the crises of the modern world, and it's really played out in the art world, is that a very small number of individuals are seen as being special, creative, and giving enormous amount of attention and resources. Oliver Eliasson creates a $15 million waterfall in the Hudson River. Now, that's a beautiful work and I like his work, but I think that our society is suffering from a crisis in many areas where a very small number of people are being elevated, as it were, above everybody else in ways that I think are having a very deadening and toxic effect on the psychic being of the rest of us, of everybody really. Yeah. And I think that the fact that we insist that 1,000 people's names go up on the walls of the Smithsonian is, I think of that as a political act.
That makes me want to weep. I think it's so very true.
Thank you. I'm now going to call on Sarah Velas for our second to last question. Sarah, I'm unmuting you.
Okay. Hello. I hope you all can hear me. Thank you for putting this together. And I've loved the crocheted reef for so long. And I think, and actually my question connects a lot to the statement that Margaret just made, because part of what I think is fascinating and lovely about this is that on multiple levels, this has been an ongoing series of beautiful creation where the sort of finished object that you see in the museum or the gallery space is really wonderful and exquisite, but when you see behind the scenes and how it was put together and what it's meant to the people who have collaborated, it's also a really, successful performance in a way. And so one question I had was, and I think, as you point out, it's very important to recognize that these were being put together through a group effort, but that also the final product, this is going to sound sort of shorthand, but also comes across as something of elegant aesthetics and is sublime in its own right, but that these two things are working together is what makes it so special. And I was curious if, even though the strong efforts are made on your behalf to highlight all the participants, I wonder how much does that come across in a setting like the Venice Biennale, where the kind of inherent structures are just only thinking about it in this auteur sort of way. So I'm just, in that particular framework, how did the Reef play out to the audience of the Biennale?
Can I answer that question, Fuzzy? So the Biennale was a very interesting setting because they have very, very strict rules in the Venice Biennale about who can be credited. because it's such a big formal deal to say you're in the Venice Biennale. And I had to fight for almost a year to get the right to have our contributors included in the labeling. It wasn't that was a thing that wasn't coming from the curator, who was very on board with what we wanted to do, but from the hierarchy that controls the Biennale. And it took me untold hours of wrangling and arguing to get them to allow me to include the names of our contributors, and they eventually did. But what that shows you is how much the art world is not set up to enable the crediting of lots and lots of people.
Not only did you choose to ask for it, which not everybody would, but you also had to fight to make it happen. And it sounds like you had to fight very, very hard. So that in itself seems like an important layer, which probably didn't come across at the Biennale, only because they probably wouldn't allow you to shine even additional light on not only did you have to fight to make that happen.
Oh, yes. I mean, I think I often say to people that I have spent so much time with so many institutions fighting this battle that, you know, I could have been using that time to create more corals. You know, the management behind a project like this is easily as much work as the crocheting of the labor of crocheting. and nobody, and as you say, Sarah, and thank you for asking the question, nobody sees this struggle. And I actually think this struggle is really important because it highlights how difficult it is, even for very innovative avant-garde organizations in the art world, like the Biennale, to actually loosen their structures enough to accommodate this multi-authorship. And I think it's a discussion that really needs to be had.
Can I say something in relation to Sarah's question too? Thank you, Sarah. We regard this as possibly the most important contribution we have to make to the art world, insofar as we're interested in making a contribution to the art world. Margaret does most of the paperwork. The paperwork is monumental. I keep telling her we should have a show of the paperwork, and every single exhibition, every single one, she has to fight for the attribution of these people. And then it got to a point where the gallery started, they liked the community aspect and they wanted the 200 names on the wall, but what they didn't want is our name. Because like, if it's a community project and all these other people are making it, then you people are nobody. So Margaret had to fight to have our name. But the best story of all is that when we decided to make a book, we actually had a New York publisher who was interested in doing the book, but when Margaret put it to him that there were 10,000 people at that time had to be named, and this was going to take up 22 pages. He said, no, that's a waste of paper. I'm not having 22 pages of just people's names. So we decided to publish the book ourselves because they refused to acknowledge that that was a part of the work. It's a 22-page section of the book. It's a chapter, and it deserves to be there.
Amazing. I'm responding to a really concise summary from Carolina, I'm not sure, of a couple of different questions from Olan, Carolyn, and Laura Bedoyan. I don't think Laura is here anymore, and Carolyn responded earlier saying she felt her question was answered. So Carolina, could I unmute you and you kind of synthesize what you were getting from all of these questions?
Hi, everyone. My question had to do with the math and science underpinning the work of crochet corals. And my second comment following the question was, this may take a whole different webinar or a session. So I don't know that you can address it in a quick moment.
Well, I can. So the mathematics underlying the project is that if you look at the frilly curly surfaces that coral organisms make, it turns out that they're biological manifestations of a kind of geometry called hyperbolic geometry, which is an alternative to the one that we learn at school, which is called Euclidean geometry, which is the geometry of a flat surface. So these crochet coral organisms that we're making are emulations of exactly the same structures that are being made in living reef organisms. And it's a kind of mathematics that, because it's different to Euclidean mathematics, Western mathematicians actually spent almost 2,000 years trying to prove that anything like this was impossible, because it's a violation of one of the axioms of Euclid's geometry that brings this hyperbolic geometry into being. And Western mathematicians didn't think that it ought to be possible to violate Euclid's axioms, so they spent almost 2,000 years, as I said, trying to show it was impossible. And then in the 19th century, they finally realized that, well, it is mathematically possible, even if it's different to Euclid, but they still didn't think that it would be represented in the real world. And so one of the interesting questions here, and this is a subject of another webinar, is why did it take mathematicians so long to recognize that these structures are actually present all around us in the world? Now, I once asked this to some of the mathematicians who were involved in this, Dr. Dana Taimina and Dr. David Henderson, who Dana is the one who invented hyperbolic crochet. And I said, why did mathematicians not see that nature was doing these hyperbolic surfaces? And David Henderson quipped, well, there aren't that many mathematicians sit around looking at corals and sea slugs. And I said, that might be true, but they certainly see lettuce. Mathematicians eat salad. And lettuce leaves with these frilly, curly surfaces are also hyperbolic.
And the edges of many flowers.
And many flowers and cactuses. So given that mathematicians had these representations of these things in nature all around them for thousands of years, it's a very interesting story in the history of math, why they couldn't literally see these forms. But that is, as it were, another discussion.
Thank you so much.
I'd just like to end on saying a very nice thing, and thank you for your question, Carolina, is that it raises interesting questions to me and to us. Isn't it interesting that the greatest minds of Western mathematics spent almost 2,000 years trying to prove that these forms couldn't happen, and yet brainless corals and sea slugs were meanwhile getting on with it? So it raises a lovely question. What does it mean to know mathematics? Does a coral, in some sense, know mathematics? And Chrissy and I would like to claim that in some sense they do.
And can I just say one final thing? And if you just crochet one coral reef, you too can become an official polyp. We are all polyps now.
Thank you. I'm turning it back to Tristan now.
Great. Thank you, Bees. Thank you, Margaret and Christine, and thank you, Doug. It's been a fantastic conversation. I know there's many, many more layers and directions we could take this, but I love that kind of ending note of this idea of corals knowing mathematics and this idea of a truly sort of biological, mathematical knowledge. So thank you everyone for participating. We have a couple things we'd like to announce coming up for next week. So these Interdependence Salons are going to be happening each Thursday, and the program next week will be Olan Jones and Doug Lee from the Metabolic Studio, hosted by Ryan Albert, and they will be talking about the Metabolic Studio's Interdependence Choir, a project which draws a line with sound, connecting so many sort of layers and levels of the Metabolic Studio's practice, from the conversion of an 80-foot tall steel silo in the abandoned Pittsburgh plate glass factory in the Owens Valley into a giant sonically resonant instrument, to the ongoing community choir practice of the studio, and to the 10 plus year binodal practice of the studio, connecting the floodplain of the LA River to the Owens Valley watershed, which is the source of this city's water. So be sure to tune in next Thursday for that conversation. We're going to close with a poem, but before we do that, I'm going to turn over to Rainer from the Metabolic Studio. She has a couple shout outs that she'd like to do.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Christine, Margaret, and Doug, and everyone for joining today. I would like to just take a few minutes to address ways African Americans are challenged during this pandemic. We are already dealing with epidemics, poverty, lack of health care, which leads to underlying health issues, making us more susceptible to the coronavirus. In predominantly African American communities, there are water shutoffs continued during this pandemic in Flint and in Detroit. And as we all know, the numbers are significantly higher in African American communities. And on top of all of this, we are still facing racial tensions and injustice. In February, Ahmaud Arbery was fatally shot while jogging unarmed in his neighborhood in Georgia. It wasn't until people were outraged and protested and took to social media that his shooters were finally arrested just last week. Ahmaud would have celebrated his 26th birthday this past Friday. Many around the world walked and jogged and ran for 2.23 miles. This was symbolic of the date he was fatally shot, February 23rd. How can we not be angry, saddened, when these horrific, senseless murders in modern day are still on rise? The Breonna Taylors, the Philando Castiles, the Sandra Blands, and the list goes on and on. It is also with heavy heart for me to mention the passing of Carolina Berry. She passed away on April 29th. She was 92. She was so fond of the work of Lauren and the Metabolic Studio performed with veterans during the Strawberry Flag Project at the West VA, West Los Angeles campus. Carolina was deeply grateful to Lauren for launching the movement to bring 387 acres of her family's land, deeded in 1888 by a landowner and her great aunt, Arcadia DeBaker, to the War Department as a home for veterans in perpetuity, back to its intended purpose as a home. This work coincided with the legacy she left behind of her years of dedication and fight on behalf of the veterans to welcome back into their rightful home. Carolina's nonprofit, the 1887 Fund, will continue to fight to get the historic chapel, the oldest building on Wilshire Boulevard, located at the West LA VA, fully restored. They are about to obtain the lease and hope to finally make progress with Carolina's legacy project. It is also with heavy heart for me to mention Terrence Lyons' passing on January 29th. He was an Army veteran, writer, and investigative reporter for the Metabolic Studio. Metabolic Studio's 10 years of monthly and then quarterly veteran publications. He was an essential part of our Strawberry Flag Project from the beginning in 2009 until his passing. Terrence occupied our Strawberry Bulletin News office in the empty spaces of the California Home of Veterans at the West LA VA, where he and Lauren and the Metabolic Studio team members researched legal proceedings where donor intention was upheld in law courts, which inspired the Metabolic Studio's position paper, Preserving a Home for Veterans. Let's just take a few moments of silence for these individuals. On a lighter note, an update for Mr. Bobby Shelton, a veteran and also our dearest friend who maintained Arcadia's Garden, a project of the Metabolic Studio on the West LA VA site. Mr. Bobby maintained the garden from the beginning in 2009 until he recently retired March of last year. Arcadia's Garden is still blooming with fava beans, mulberries, collard greens, Swiss chard, and tomatoes, maintained by on-site veterans. Mr. Bobby is doing well and happily growing food on his family homeland in Arkansas. Lastly, LA is getting government-run tent city. All it took was 40 years and a pandemic. Tent cities and tiny house villages for homeless people have been taboo in Los Angeles, where they've been deemed too expensive to maintain, too difficult to dislodge once established. But the novel coronavirus has a way of upending the most deeply entrenched thinking. A few weeks ago, the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs set up LA's first temporary tent city in 4 decades. It's for veterans without homes, 25 initially, with a plan to expand 50 as needed so they can ride out this COVID-19 crisis by sheltering in place and social distancing in their own tents. The veterans are provided drinking water, 3 meals a day, porta potties, and electrical outlets to charge their phones. The site has on-site security and healthcare, as well as access to case management, substance abuse counseling, mental health support. Lisa Tompkins, a former medic in the U.S. Air Force, is the only woman at the camp. She was staying at the Salvation Army's Bell Shelter, but was forced to leave when the shelter reduced the capacity to minimize the spread of COVID-19. Lastly, but surely not least, please, please, please attend Fridays, 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, INYO LA Standing Committee virtual meeting to show dissent for LADP's water grabs against the Payuhu Nandu tribe. It is important to get as many folks from LA as possible to make public comments. So sign on, speak up. The link and the info will be in the chat bar. And thank you all so much.
Thank you, Dee. Okay, so in closing, we traditionally close these Interdependence Salons with a poetry reading, and this week's closing poem will be read by, and I believe also written, a poem of her own writing, our very own Maya Bond.
Hi, everyone. I want to preface this with thanking Dee for that beautiful shout out to all those people that she just gave, and also to talk about tomorrow's LADWP Standing Committee meeting and how crucial it is that as many of us show up as possible and that as many of us submit public comments as possible. You can do that by looking in the chat bar and following those links. And I'm going to read my public comment that I submitted just to give some information and to kind of give awareness to folks about what they can say and what's going on. Each year, LA County uses approximately 213 billion gallons of water. 50 to 60% of that water is imported from the Colorado River Basin, from mountain rivers in Northern California, and from Payuhu Nandu. Each year, 112 billion gallons of water runs across Los Angeles' streets, picking up pollution before being washed out to the ocean. That's 50% of Los Angeles' total water that we allow to wash away without hydrating the people, the plants, the animals of Los Angeles. How could you propose pumping more water out of this valley when you allow the very amount Los Angeles needs to import go to waste? How could you propose to pump more water out of this valley when the people who are from here, the people whose land you are on, the Numu people are telling you to stop and to stop now? Will you allow another 100 years to go by living on stolen water? LADWP continues to make bad decisions and bad investments, We cannot afford to continue to pump water out of the Sierras when climate change has already significantly lessened its snowpack. We must invest in stormwater capture, in remediating contaminated groundwater, in filling the 800,000 acre-feet of unutilized available storage capacity in our groundwater basins, in more pump and treat systems, in personal rooftop water systems, in depaving our city. We must end this system of theft and oppression. Please stand with us and fight for all life. Stand with us to create long-term solutions.
Thank you, Maya. And thank you, everybody. Thank you, Christine. Thank you, Margaret. Thank you, Doug. Thank you, Lauren and the Metabolic Studio team. And thank you all our audience members for joining us today. We hope to see you next week. And we'll unmute everybody now to allow for sort of a post-conversation mingling and as people say goodbye.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello. Lots of fun.
This is saying the fuel cap could also be a problem.
Bye. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you now.
Thank you. Much
Thanks
love.
for your
Yeah, it
brilliant
says the
work.
gas cap vent
Let's keep
could
up
be
the
clogged.
fight.
It says the gas cap vent could be clogged. I don't know where that is or what that is.
Thank you, Christine and Margaret. It was nice to see you and to hear you. Lots of love.
Is it Nadia?
It is.
Nadia, lovely to see you.
Thank you. It was wonderful to see and hear both of you. I've missed you so much.
We've missed you, Nadia. We think of you often.
Oh, thank you. Same. The same. It's nice to see that you're both well.
Thank you, Margaret and Christine. Great to see you.
Roxanne, hello.
Roxanne.
Christine, I love you. Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you for that reading, Maya. That was really fantastic.
Maya, can you send me your text?
Oh, yes, I'd love to.
Me too.
And so we can get the link in the chat bar where we can submit our comments. Is that right?
Yeah.
Here, I'll send you a text with the email to submit your comments.
Thank you. Yeah, no, thank you for.
I'll send that to anyone who
Yeah.
wants that. You can put your email in the chat and I'll.
No, thank you all for bringing that to our attention. We would really like to submit a comment.
Thank you for your beautiful shout outs also, Derainer. That was amazing and really deeply felt today. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Can I ask you a question about the crochet work? If you've got time.
Yes.
Hi. I'm in Los Angeles. I'm an artist. But basically, I'm wondering if when people do the crochet, I'm wondering about the element of prayer and trance when you start to do, heartfelt work, and also because Australia has an Indigenous community, I'm wondering about visualizations. If you implement anything, or if people report doing anything like that with existing reefs in order to communicate with the reef back and forth while doing the work. See what I'm saying? To visualize that they grow back.
Unfortunately, the reefs in Australia are very hard, not near civilization, so it's very expensive to go there. So,
but in your mind, like a prayerful kind of, when you do a kind of repetitive task, it becomes like trance in a sense,
Yeah, no, I mean, people report, and I can certainly report myself from having done thousands of hours of crochet. It's incredibly meditative. I mean, for me, it's better than, I can't really sit there still. So for me, I can achieve some kind of meditation through doing this repetitive hand activity that I don't have to think about at all when I'm doing it. But it is meditative.
Yeah.
In that, there's a very nice article that was written a few years ago by a woman called Leslie Dick that was published in the art journal called Extra. She wrote an article specifically about this dimension of doing handicraft work.
But I think the lady's asking the question, do we actually think of it as it were, being a prayer for the reef itself?
To affect the reef itself.
I think the way that I could answer that question is to say the impetus for us to do this project was because we grew up in the state where the Great Barrier Reef is. And when we started the project was at the time that scientists were understanding that global warming was the force that was beginning to absolutely decimate the Great Barrier Reef. And literally the night we started the project, Chrissy joked that if the Great Barrier Reef ever died out, that our woolly reef would be something to remember it by. So the whole impetus to do the project really was to draw attention to the fact that the Great Barrier Reef was under serious threat. And, 15 years later, after we started it, scientists are saying right now that the Great Barrier Reef could disappear in the next few decades. Right now, it's experiencing the worst bleaching event in its history. So we really did do the project as something that was meant to draw attention to the fact that this magnificent thing was being devastated. And now everybody's talking about that, but they weren't 15 years ago. So the whole project was designed in some sense to help, to be our little modest contribution to helping whatever forces need to be activated to save it.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Margaret. Thank you, Christine.
Yeah,
Thank you,
Margaret.
John. Thank you, Lauren.
Thank you.
Thank
you, Margaret. Thank you, Christine.
Thank you.
Thank you, Doug Harvey.
Margaret. Thank you, Christine.
Hi, Caroline.
Thank you, Tristan.
Thank you, Tristan.
Thank you, Tristan.
Thank you all. Thanks for the beauty and the inspiration.